What if efficiency was the real enemy?
The defining ideology is that every moment that we spend that we are not completing some form of transaction is actually looked at like a transaction cost, like it's something that's getting us in the way of efficient market exchange. You should absolutely be thinking about how you're developing your perspective now, because otherwise you're about to get flattened. Technology is under industrial and post-industrial capitalism. It causes a small portion of people at the top to be rewarded, and it causes the majority of people to be punished. We've sort of been conditioned to be quite passive, like we've been incentivized to respond to everything in a zero friction way, and the task of like struggling and looking out for what we want and that process of active discovery has become harder and harder for us as we've been encouraged to be more and more passive.
Does it feel like almost like we need to be pushing past the barriers of efficiency, or have efficiency, eventually become a barrier to full realization?
Well, I think that's the thing, is that
I'm Bradley Sherman, and this is Population Next. And on today's show, we're with Eugene Healey. He's a massive online creator who's sharing his perspective on the world today. In our conversation, we're going to cover everything from this enemy of efficiency to different generations, and of course, the great cultural transformation that we're going through right now. Eugene, welcome to Population Next.
Thank you for having me, Bradley.
I love your content. You're one of the more prolific, I think, TikTok creators out there, because you're speaking to, I think, what a lot of us are feeling in our core these days about the way of the world and how culture is evolving or devolving around us. And one of the pieces that I think has been so transformative is something that's been itching at the back of my head for some time now, is how easy it is to live, to get access to things. And you argue that we need a little bit more friction in our lives to make things better. Walk me through what that actually means.
I think, look, I have to make a distinction in that. I don't necessarily believe that our lives themselves have gotten easier, certainly from an economic perspective. Like economic indicators would suggest that for young people, a task of survival, let alone comfort, is getting more and more difficult. I think it's the way that we've been sold by the way that our lives have been sold by a particular group of in particular big tech players. If you've spent any time working in big tech or working with big tech, which I have, you'll know, or not just big tech, just tech in general, you'll know that friction is a key principle that sort of defines the way that they look at a lot of problems. Like, how can we remove friction from this process? And that is things like, one-touch payments. If you think about Amazon, almost like they're the ultimate there, where they were like, let's just remove all of the friction from the shopping process, to the extent, let's actually make the shopping process predictive. So rather than you even having to search for what it is that you want, like, we'll just put it in your cart for you, and we'll make sure that happens. That happens almost subconsciously. And I think that has sort of, that idea about let's remove friction from the process has gotten bigger and bigger and bigger over the years. I mean, it happened in the world of content as well. Like TikTok's For You pageification of the internet was effectively about turning discovery into a passive process as well. So it said, okay, your follow account doesn't matter, likes don't matter, nothing matters. The only thing that matters is dwell time, and we'll push all of the content to you rather than you having to go seek it out. I think these ideas have sort of snowballed, and we're now at a point where I suppose the defining ideology is that every moment that we spend that we are not completing some form of transaction is actually looked at like a transaction cost, like it's something that's getting us in the way of efficient market exchange. And I think like that is the ideology that's sort of swelled over the way that we live our lives. And because technology is so influential in the way that we live our lives, they're not just tech products, they're social engineering products effectively. We've sort of been conditioned to be quite passive. Like it's, and again, I try not to blame individuals for this. It's almost like we've been incentivized to respond to everything in a zero friction way, the task of like struggling and looking out for what we want, and that process of active discovery has become harder and harder for us as we've been encouraged to be more and more passive. And I think like that was the Substack that I just put up was about why friction is necessary. I would say, like, that came out of a keynote that I did for Pinterest, actually, where we were having a conversation around like what's the importance of the discovery mechanism. And for Pinterest, it is like Pinterest, yes, it does serve you content and its algorithm, but actually it wants you to go hunting. Like it actually wants you to go out and discover what it is that you like for yourself. And I think like that process of discovery, like that's important for a variety of reasons. Like I think it's really important. It's only through, I would say, like engaging with like challenges and contradictions in the world, but also in yourself, that you actually end up developing your own taste and your perspective. And I think that, like there's been a million think pieces launched about how taste is the differentiator in the age of artificial intelligence. And I'm not going to go through all of that. Like I think there are other people who have written better stuff on that than me. But I think, the premise is effectively that, like the way I look at artificial intelligence is it's always going to be a composite. It's a composite of opinions, and it's not predictive in the way that perhaps people think it is. It's really good at remixing what already exists, but it's not able to create newness. And the only way that can be developed, I think, is through quite specific human perspectives, not composites. And the only way to develop your perspective is, I think, to go out there and actually to struggle against the things that already exist in the world, and to make a determination of like what's meaningful to you and you alone.
So does it feel like almost like we need to be pushing past the barriers of efficiency, or have efficiency, eventually become a barrier to full realization?
Well, I think that's the thing, is that, yes, exactly, that efficiency itself has become the barrier. When everything is looked at through such, I mean, even artificial intelligence, I think, is a really interesting conversation. It's something that I was talking to with another creator last week, is this technology that is being unleashed right now is, if the rumors are to be believed, and increasingly, like, I'm buying into those rumors as well, this is one of the most significant transformative technologies since the Industrial Revolution that's going to fundamentally reshape the world of work, and particularly knowledge work. And yet the entirety of that technology, for now at least, seems subordinated to the current economic circumstances that we have. We're only looking at it through the lens of the way that the world is right now, in that, okay, it's going to make us more efficient at our jobs. It's going to enable this or that. It's going to enable us to do things a lot faster. It's going to enable more productivity. If there were any other ideas for how we might organize our society lying around, maybe we would consider it as a tool for effectively our own emancipation from work. Like maybe we would consider it as this is the actual, in the same way that we campaigned for the 40-hour work week all those years ago, like maybe we would have been able to use this technology to campaign for a completely alternate way of living. And I think it's that like this efficiency logic has become so ingrained in the way that we believe the world operates and the way that the world must operate. We're simply unable to imagine any alternative.
Right. I think they probably felt that way during the Industrial Revolution too, or at least leading into it, was the world exists in a certain context and this is the way it's always been. But that disruptive force of moving into the factories, away from the fields, changing the dynamic of way society was ordered, really did push us into an entirely different era. So you're effectively arguing that we could be going into an entirely different era altogether too, in part because of AI?
Yeah. I mean, I think that's a perfect example of the industrial era. I read a really fantastic book. I can't remember where it was, but it was what the Industrial Revolution did. It created the concept of time as we understand it now. Like before the Industrial Revolution, time was looked at as cyclical. So things change, but the way that the world goes, it's eventually the same. Not only from a technological process, it was okay, there's rapid advancements in technology, but people live their lives according to crop cycles. Like people live their lives according to like festivals and things like that. So the world just kind of turned in a circular way. And it was only with the Industrial Revolution that time was able to be compressed into units. And so it started to push us forward. And it started to compress time into productive units as well. And then of course the Industrial Revolution also replaced. This is from Atul Gawande's Being Mortal. He talks about the Industrial Revolution changed the mechanism, not the mechanism. They changed the values of our society. The valuation and the veneration of the family unit was replaced with the veneration of the independent self. I always remember that. That was, I thought, such a brilliant quote, where it really moved our society from a society that was about looking after the family, multiple generations in one household. It broke families apart, literally, younger men, and especially going to go work in the cities. And it really started the triumph of the independent self, but also independence measured specifically through physical independence, the independent body's ability to produce and compete. And so I think that those values have been in place, that the society that we're living in today, they're still very much the same values. And I think it's going to be interesting to see how those values shift when now, I think the main difference coming within artificial intelligence is simply those things that happened to basket weavers and artisans and craftspeople back in the Industrial Revolution. Now they're coming for knowledge workers. I think that's the most significant piece, is they're coming for people who perform intellectual labor. And that is a very, very wide portion of the workforce, and it's a very educated portion of the workforce as well. So I think that it's our turn now. All of the technologies, when you think about like robotics and efficiency and things that have been happening, they've all been affecting like the working class up until this point for the last 50, 100 years. Now this is something that's coming for us too.
Now I believe you've written about how, during this period of great transformation that we're in, that people who are truly creative, that really dedicate themselves to the art of being creative or knowledgeable, really now hold a competitive edge against the rest of the flock, so to speak. Tell me a little bit more about where that comes from, because I'm starting to make these associations here between, those basket weavers, which maybe in the 1850s were a dime a dozen, but now you find a basket weaver who's truly doing the art, and we treat it as high art versus just being an everyday object, because we can find that everyday object mass produced at Walmart or Costco or any of the big box chains.
So I think a good way of looking at technology and artificial intelligence is our technology is under industrial and post-industrial capitalism. It causes a small portion of people at the top to be rewarded, and it causes the majority of people to be punished. So, we don't have many basket weavers left.
True.
There is a small proportion of people that are probably rewarded by that for having not just true craft, but also true perspective on how to develop that craft, because that's what we build margin around. The majority of them were consigned to minimum wage and below work, effectively. I saw a really fantastic example of this applied to artificial intelligence in my field at a conference in Marrakesh a fortnight ago, where I watched a person called Jonas Hagel, who's a guy that he's got to be around my age, absolutely brilliant, runs his own agency called Builders Club. And he did the ChatGPT Super Bowl ad this year. And I think it was really interesting because he did the ChatGPT, at the AI platform. And he was talking about how his agency uses artificial intelligence in his creative workflow. And it was the first time that I've seen it integrated in a creative workflow that's made me go, this is what it means for the small minority to be rewarded by this technology, because they would brainstorm ideas first, and then they would take a couple of those brainstorms and they would build the effectively a wireframe of those concepts with artificial intelligence, and it looked ridiculous, but it gave them a direction of, okay, actually this might work or this can't work. You know, they're like, you can't, they were like, they work in a lot of CG, and they're like, you can't build a sandstorm in CG, or if you can, it takes an extraordinary amount of money, but you can build it like that in artificial intelligence. So they used it to concept, and then the concepts that they found compelling, then they rebuilt them entirely in CGI. And I think, you know, he said something really important on stage where he said the thing about these technologies is they can't create meaning or context. And so if you don't have, you know, if you've got two photos in front of you, both made by artificial intelligence, but you don't have an understanding of photography, shot composition and lighting, etc., you're not going to be able to tell me which of these two images is better. And you're not going to be able to tell me why these two images is better. And you're not going to be able to prompt and ask for more of what you're seeing in image A versus image B. So unless you already have that level of meaning and context, you're not going to be able to do anything with the technology itself. And so the people that are already very, very highly skilled and importantly have a really good perspective on, I want more of this, they're the ones that stand to benefit in this age. And I would say for anyone I think about myself as 8 years ago when I was getting started in brand strategy, and I got a tool like ChatGPT plonked in front of me to be able to ask the kind of questions that I can ask it now. I would have absolutely no idea what to ask it. Whereas now with the level of meaning and context that I have, I use it like a sparring partner. So I say, give me ideas for this. And then I say, well, no, actually the 90% of this is dog shit. But that 10%, I want you to follow that thread. And then what I end up actually using ends up being nothing like even what I've prompted it for, but it just helped me ideate in the direction that I needed to. So I'm rewarded. This technology rewards me. It rewards me because it's helping to compress the journey from A to B, but still what I monetize on myself as a strategist is not my labor. I monetize on my perspective. And I think that kind of is the key thing for me, is that the monetization on perspective will not change. If anything, I would say people are starting to be willing to pay more and more for perspective. They're just willing to pay less and less for labor.
Yeah, that seems to be the constant pinch. And, you know, I mean, certainly you alluded to this earlier about how certainly in the Western nations, we've been losing purchasing power now for decades, and that's creating a real crunch and also remaking, I think, some of the family unit, you know, so even here in the United States, because of the insane cost of housing that we're experiencing here, more and more people are living in multi-generational households. About 1 in 5 Americans is living under one roof. Thinking about this kind of shift in the structure of the family, in some cases returning to an old norm, what are you starting to see as some openings for brands that might want to consider a multi-generational strategy?
I mean, I think that question is interesting because it goes back to a conversation around values, you know, and what values does a brand want to attach itself to? I think there is in general, there is an interesting piece here around trying to define success and trying to define, there's an interesting piece here around trying to define success differently than merely through the veneration of the independent self. Like, I've worked on aged care projects in the past. Like, I've worked on several aged care projects, and a lot of that was trying to answer this question as well. Of course, it was trying to do it for older people at that particular point in time. So once you lose your physical independence, what's the value of your life? But I think there is an interesting piece here to be done for younger people as well, to say, like, your physical independence, your ability to produce and compete, particularly in a place like the United States, where that Protestant work ethic is so, you know, you're 2 weeks of annual leave a year, which I find absolutely mental.
It's insane.
It is. I don't know how you do it. I don't know how you live. To be able to like reshape, what those values are, or to at least be able to say, like, your life has value if you are not able to be entirely physically independent, or at the very least, if you're able to recognize that, like, you and your family, you need one another, and multiple generations under one household is not a failure, there is mutual support that the both of you actually require from one another. And I think like for a brand to be able to claim that narrative in an interesting way, like certainly it's something that hasn't been explored yet, I would say, in earnest. Not in the same way that it has in the East.
Right, right, exactly. And it seems like the East is starting to pull some of our values in these days, which is very concerning, certainly for long-term prospects. But I'm curious about some of the work you've done around older adults in particular. I think you wrote a piece for The Guardian earlier this year about how we've gotten older adult marketing wrong. What's your core thesis there? Like, what have we really done wrong here with older adults? And how do we fix it?
To me, the issue is so I wrote this piece for Think with Google. To me, the issue is it all stems from this industrial revolution era shift in values to the shift in values to the veneration of the independent self. And so in doing so, we've made our society terrified of the loss of physical independence. And rather than brands themselves wanting to dive into that challenge, we've found basically the opposite, is brands wanting to reinforce those fears. And that's much of what brands do, is they take our fears and our desires and they sell it back to us. So what we see with a lot of, I would say, boomer and boomer plus marketing is that fear and desire reflected. So there is across the board, there is always lifestyle communities, retirement villages, aged care, assisted living, etc. It's all about maintain your independence. Maintain your independence, have your independence. And I always think that's I think that's it. For me, it's the boomer equivalent of authenticity. You know, with millennial and Gen Z brands, we're always trying to market authenticity, right?
Yeah.
Just like with boomer brands, we're always trying to market independence. They both, for me, are correlated in that it's a vanishing point, and that like it's something that is always reached for, but you can never have, because it's the one thing that you can't have when you're older is physical independence. You can look, and that's not to say that you can't work out and you can't maintain a little bit more, but you're going to have to acknowledge at some point you're going to need help. And I think the way that it's sold of, oh, you're going to need help, but the help is going to allow you to not need help, like that to me is an inherent contradiction. And I think that, and sometimes it gets worse and worse. Like we get subjected to these more and more extreme displays of, okay, this octogenarian's running a marathon, this person's going skydiving, like this person's riding motorbikes up until the ages of 102. And I think like, we end up with this kind of caricature of old age that these through all of these activities, when I take a look at these images, it seems to be like the exact same type of infantilization that if you put a baby on a motorbike, like it ends up being the exact same thing. It's this kind of like this friction between the image and the activity and the person that it's being delivered in. I think that there needs to be a lot more like recognition of the fact that your physical independence is the one thing that is leaving you, but your value is not defined by your level of physical independence.
So boomers and boomer plus might actually respond well to authenticity, or do you think they'd reject it, given this kind of fight we have against dying and getting older and declining in our physical well-being? Or do you think that we're always going to want to crave for that?
I think it's look, it depends on where you live. It depends on how you've lived up until that particular point. Look, like I said, in the United States with the Protestant work ethic and the value of hard work. Although that being said, that is starting to break. So there's been a couple of like really important surveys that I've seen over the past couple of months about how Americans are starting to believe that hard work no longer leads to reward. So as the economic scenario gets more dire, the Wall Street Journal surveyed like 1,500 people this year, and they found 70% of them no longer believe in the American dream. So in fact, it was worse than that. 70% of Americans no longer believe the American dream, which is if you work hard, you'll be rewarded. That's the American dream. They no longer believe it's true or was ever true. So it's not just an assault on the current iteration of the cultural myth, it's an assault on an assault on the historical myth as well. So as that starts to break, you may start to see different attitudes emerging, and you can already see the friction between the younger and older generations, of like younger generations that are into content creation and streaming and all of these new era jobs, which I think like a lot of old people look down on. But I think like the reality is, younger people live in an economic scenario now where they're well aware that the only way to a comfortable life is to skip rungs on the ladder. Like you cannot climb the corporate ladder in the same way, because your hard work will not be rewarded. When you see that artificial intelligence is setting a blowtorch to the future of knowledge work, so why would I study hard, get into a good university, accrue a significant amount of debt, six-figure debt again in your country? Mine, in Australia is significantly less, and then go work at a corporate job, and then that corporate career that pays off effectively over the course of like 10, 20, 30 years. Why would you do that when you're being offered no security anymore? So I think like for younger generations, work and reward are being untethered. There's probably going to be a little bit of an unlearning of that for older people if they learn that lesson at all. But they will still have to learn the lesson. Where is my value? What's my role in society now that I'm no longer the person that's able to produce and compete and create economic value?
Right. And maybe the boomers and the boomers plus will push us to a new definition. They've been pretty good at kind of changing the narrative on their entire generational cohort throughout their lives.
The natural answer is that they will find the role that they are already in as consumers. So what the boomer generation is absconding with is extraordinary material wealth, more material wealth, whether or not they can admit it or not, more material wealth than any generation before them, and probably any generation after them as well. And so perhaps they will just merely relish their newfound life as just pure consumers, and the customer is always right. And I do think that the worlds of aged care and like all of that will be reinvented and reshaped in their image to be much more individualistic and to be much more luxurious. So I think like real luxury aged stuff awaits. But I still do think if I was to create a marketing agency today, I would make a boomer marketing agency, because I still think that older people are not just misrepresented, I think they're narrowly represented. I think there is this conversation about independence, and that's the narrative that gets sold and sold and sold. But it's not like, if you go and look at like young people and how we're marketed to, there's a million archetypes, right? There's a million different ways to be a young person, and there's a million different forms of desire. Whereas for older people, it's just maintain your independence, And so I think that like coming to a more pluralistic definition of what success looks like in old age, and like what aspiration looks like in old age, and making what all the different ways, city versus country, and like, how it might look psychographically as well. Like I think that is a thing that will really open up as people start to recognize where all the spending power is really lying.
You seem to be enamored with the boomers. I'm curious though, of the different generational cohorts that you work with, that you target for these different clients of yours, which one really stands out as the most dynamic? Is it, in fact, the boomers?
I don't target generationally, to be honest. In fact, like one of the, I try not to, I should say, in that perhaps a brand that I work with has if I work in age or disability care, then everyone is over the age of a certain age. I try not to lock myself down too much in these generational categories, just because I believe that they're, particularly for younger cohorts, I believe they're fetishes. So the way that we talk about Gen Z in marketing in particular is a fetish. If I say Gen Z, an image is popping into your head right now of like this person, they've got this makeup, they probably, have this attitude towards gender and sexuality, there's fluidity here, et cetera, et cetera. That's a marketing category that we effectively created, that's sustained by the market research agencies, like this kind of like industrial trend report complex of this, and this is the younger workforce, and it ties into our own like our pornographic obsession with youth as well. So I think that every like what to me separates generations is technological, economic, and political context. So, what separates the generations is what other things that these particular generations are exposed to, and how does that change their operating context. So I think, like, for instance, for the boomer generation, it was the specter of the Cold War, but it was also the most extraordinary situation of economic prosperity that the likes of which this world will never see again. It was the fact that they had effectively socialism when they were growing up, free education, that then was converted into extreme private capitalism and resource wealth and real estate wealth, etc. For the millennial generation, I think it was, there was still this kind of like hustle and grind set sort of thing. There was the big tech boom that allowed a lot of millennials to still abscond with extraordinary material and physical wealth. It was kind of like they lived through the death of the American dream through the GFC, like the crash. Then they lived through also the zero interest rate millennial direct consumer boom era. So the millennial lifestyle subsidy, like from 2011 to 2020, just this quantitative easing, meaning there was so much cash that all of these like zombie businesses were basically around, that like you could go and get a $400 million valuation on a concept that you came up with in your garage. And so, like, we lived through this like hustling grind set era that all just kind of came crashing down with COVID. And then you've got Gen Z and Gen Alpha that came after that. They were born after the sun had already set on the golden age of capitalism. And so, they live in a situation where things look worse. The outlook is there's no way of cutting it. It just looks worse. And so they're looking at effectively having to completely, I think that the generation is interesting because they are having to look at different ways of defining success, and they're having to look at different ways of organizing society, I would say, being able to recognize like this one absolutely does not work, and it certainly does not work for us.
Interesting. So I'm curious. We've written a bit about politics, or at least political branding, and without turning this into a political conversation, you mentioned something about the Democrats and how the Democrats think they've got a branding problem, but it actually might be a policy problem. Their platform isn't right. Do you think part of that might be driven by those lived experiences of kind of on average, older cohort of elected officials that are trying to get the public to go along with their vision for the future, which seems to be more of the same?
Yeah. I think there is a particular technocrat class that lives within the Democrats, but also lives within the UK Labour Party. I mean, like the Canadian Labour Party right now is run by a person who was an investment banker.
Right.
And it lives within Australian Labor as well. Although, like Labor's difference in Australia is that it's founded in coalition with the unions. So that does make it a little bit more. That it does make it have a little bit of an interesting class bent, because Australia has I would say a thriving middle class. We call them tradies. A thriving middle class tradie population where you can make a lot of money doing trades in this country because we have a really strong union. We have really strong unions in construction, mining, etc. Sorry, I was getting a little bit off track here, but I think we don't, like, you don't have any of those worker protections in the United States, and so for the average person, life is getting worse. And I think there is a recognition that the old thing has been dead since the GFC. The old idea of neoliberal capitalism has been dead since the GFC. Like, we're living in the zombie times right now, and you can either accept that and try to create something new, which is what Trump is doing. Is the old thing doesn't work. Let's try the new thing, which is actually the old thing.
Right. It's just a rebrand.
But it is a new thing.
Yeah.
Or you can try to cling to, well, let's go back to the thing that we all acknowledged was working, but hey, we believe that the thing that wasn't really working is working a little bit better than the thing right now, which I just don't think is a very compelling argument. And
No,
I
it's
think
certainly
that
not
there's
certainly not exciting by any
exactly,
stretch.
and I think that that is the challenge, is the challenge in like learning to accept that you don't have a messenger problem. You have the problem is with the message itself, and no amount of branding or tinkering or finding the right influences is going to solve the fact that the ideology that the messaging is based on has been fundamentally disavowed by everyone across the political spectrum. There's not a single person I think that really there is not a significant majority of people that really believe that that system is going to work for them, because they can recognize that system's culpability in creating the one that we have now.
Yeah. And it certainly seems to be very broken. Eugene, we just have time for one more question. And I want to leave this a little bit open ended because you're so good at this. Leave us with a one uncomfortable provocation. Like, what is something that should be on our radar that isn't on our radar today, and how you're locking into it?
There are a couple. Look, the one thing that I always would try to leave people with is stuff that I've discussed a lot today, which is the value of your technical labor is about to be flattened if you work in knowledge. Develop your perspective now. That may mean doing something unconscionable, like what I did, which is become a content creator. It was not something that I had ever expected for my career until I started doing it, and I began to reap extraordinary rewards for it. I think like the interesting thing for me with content is it is not just an outcome, but it's a practice as well. Making things every week is a commitment to thinking about things every week and thinking about how to articulate things every week, which is a development of my perspective. And the constant development of my perspective and the constant honing of that perspective, that sharpness, is what is allowing me to command much higher salary than I was only a year ago. So that's one thing that I would say is like, you should absolutely be thinking about how you're developing your perspective now, because otherwise you're about to get flattened. And then the second is a completely different one, which is something that I've been thinking a lot about recently, which is more along cultural lines. I've had a video that's performed really, really well. And I always think it's really interesting when I've got really well performing videos. It means that I've hit a cultural nerve. This one was about soft clubbing and coffee shop raves. And how
I saw that. I loved it.
Yeah. And just how I think they're just bullshit, effectively. Not the phenomenon, I should clarify here, not the phenomenon of partying when you're sober. I'm not discouraging that. What I find more sinister is the way that these things are branded and packaged and sold. And I think there is a real push right now to soften the hard edge of things. And that's what soft clubbing is. It's softening the hard edge of environments that are subversive and anti-efficiency, that are there about, effectively, when they're really good, like they're about imagining alternate ways of organizing things. Like they're really mind expanding places, and they're really accepting places as well. And I think, we have a lot of phenomenons in our culture right now that are trying to push us towards the mean. They're trying to push us back into the center. And I don't mean the center politically. I mean the center culturally. And I think if we want to find new ways of organizing things, like we have to push further and further out into the margins. I just would encourage people to look for marginal experiences. That can be difficult to find in the algorithm, but not impossible, I would say. I found all sorts of extraordinary things, just because there's lots of really interesting creators out there that are providing lots of interesting information. I would encourage people to search at the margins for things. Yeah.
Well, Eugene, this has been fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Of course. Thank you, Bradley.
As always, thank you for joining me today on Population Next. If you want to learn more about Eugene's work, you can follow his Instagram and, of course, his Substack. They're both fantastic. I highly recommend them, and links to both are in the show notes below. As always, please, please, please give us a like, comment, or subscribe to this channel. And of course, if you want to dive deeper into our demographic future, follow my own Substack at populationnext.com. That's populationnext.com. Thanks again.